conferees, staff, good morning. Are there any bill introductions? Representative Hauser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I do. 24 RS 2769, Kansas Gun Rights Preservation Act.
Committee objections? Seeing none, bill is entered. Further bill introductions? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and open the hearing on House Bill 2476. Kyle's going to give us an overview. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For my brief, the substantive provisions of this bill are pretty short, so my brief is going to be essentially a quick reading of the bill. But if you have a chance to look at the digital version of my brief, it's up with the testimony. I've included some footnotes in the brief that will take you to some additional information. One of the entities we'll be talking about today are the National Heritage Areas. Kansas and Missouri have an existing NHA. So one of the links is to the enabling legislation that Congress had passed to create that NHA. So you can go through that, read about the different provisions for appropriations, property rights, et cetera. There are also some memos by the Congressional Research Service that they've prepared about National Historic Trails and NHAs. Our own KLRD department in 2021 prepared a memo concerning the 30 by 30 initiative and NHAs. So there's also a link to that. Turning to the bill, starting on page 2, line 2, section 1, subsection A would state that designation by the United States National Park Service of any national heritage area or national historic trail that extends beyond federal land within the state of Kansas shall require the approval of the legislature of the state of Kansas. Under subsection B, state funds shall not be expended or transferred from state agencies to match federal monies for national heritage areas, national historic trails, or any similar or successor designated areas without the approval of the legislature of the state of Kansas. Under subsection C, state lands, water, property, or facilities shall not be included in any designated national heritage area, national historic trail, or any similar or successor designated areas without the approval of the legislature of the state of Kansas. House Bill 2476 would become effective upon publication in the statute book. And with that, I'd be happy to take any preliminary questions.
Committee questions of reviser? Seeing none. Oh, Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. Was this originally intended to be filed as like a House resolution or a House concurrent resolution? Because I've never seen preambles in a bill before.
So it is not too prevalent, but it is something that is done every now and then, where a bill will have a whereas preamble. If the bill were passed into law, those whereas clauses would not be part of the statute itself.
Committee, further questions? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Basically, I like this idea, but the thing that concerns me is, would this bill override federal law?
Well, if and when it were challenged in court, we would see how it would turn out. The way it's written, it does state that in order for these types of designations to be made, it would first require the approval of the legislature of the state of Kansas. Now, could that be carried out underneath the supremacy clause and preemption laws? Up for debate.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Kyle. Okay, first proponent we have is Representative Brett Fairchild. Brett, good morning. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to testify in front of your committee today. I introduced this bill a couple of months ago on behalf of Mrs. Angel Cushing. She's a conservative political activist here in Kansas. And she actually goes around the state and gives presentations on private property rights issues. So she's well known for that. And I would say she's an expert on this issue, much more so than I am. So if you have questions for me that I can't answer, I'm sure she'll be able to answer all your questions for you. We've seen a federal government that's infringed on the rights of the people, including infringing on private property rights. And I believe that problem has gotten worse with the Biden administration, particularly their 30 by 30 proposal, which is a worldwide initiative for governments to designate 30% of the Earth's land and ocean areas as protected areas by 2030. And the reason why I'm concerned about that is because I believe it's not likely that could ever be accomplished through voluntary means. I think that in order for the federal government to actually be able to accomplish that, that would have to be done through mandatory means, which would include things that would infringe on property rights, such as eminent domain. The research that I've done shows that some of the biggest proponents of the 30 by 30 initiative are also big proponents of expanding the national trails and the national heritage areas. And those people, those activists, they do see a connection between the 30 by 30 initiative and the expansion of the national trails and natural heritage areas. They see the NHAs and the national heritage areas as part of the conservation effort to promote the goals of the 30 by 30 initiative. Some of the opponents of this bill will most likely claim that this bill, they'll claim that eminent domain is not used on the national trails or on the national heritage areas. However, I would say from the research I've done, that is not exactly true. For example, the Appalachian Trail used eminent domain 400 times, and the National Park Service acquired 15,266 acres along the trail through eminent domain between 1986 and 1997, out of nearly 150,000 total acres along the trail. And I will admit that normally eminent domain is not used along these trails. However, the research that I've done shows that a lot of the biggest advocates for the national trails have basically advocated for using eminent domain in order to fill in all these gaps along the trails. And when I refer to gaps, what I'm referring to is that there's thousands of acres of privately owned land along the trails. And in some cases, the National Park Service has problems with getting the private owners along these trails to go along with allowing access to the trails along their land. And then also, in addition to that, sometimes private landowners will enter into an agreements with the National Park Service to allow the National Park Service to have access to their land for the purpose of the trails. However, oftentimes this land ends up being sold to other landowners. Land along the trails isn't always just owned by the same people. The private land along the trails often changes hands, and so when it changes hands, the new landowners do not have to go along with the original agreements that was entered into by the original landowners. And so in a lot of these instances, you have instances where these new landowners don't want to allow access to their land for the purpose of the trails, and therefore you have a lot of these, or they have to reroute along these privately owned acres of land. And so that's obviously very expensive, very cumbersome for the National Park Service to have to reroute along these privately owned acres of land. And therefore you have a lot of these activists who are big activists of the national trails who basically say, they argue that the use of eminent domain is the only realistic way to actually fill in all these gaps along the trail. And so therefore, even though eminent domain isn't commonly used along the trails, it is something that could always be potentially used. Lastly, I believe that the main goal of this legislation is simply to keep the federal government within its box. And just speaking for myself, I wouldn't personally have a problem with funding the national trails or the national heritage areas if the federal government could actually prove that they can maintain these things without infringing on private property rights. However, I just have concerns that that they may infringe on private property rights. And in addition to what I said about simply the potential of that happening, there are some things beyond eminent domain that they have been doing, such as conservation easements, which is basically a process where I would argue sometimes people are misled into these agreements, and it basically gives the federal government the authority to control people's land. And so that's a concern. But basically, if the federal government could simply prove that they could be respectful of private property rights and not infringe on these rights, I wouldn't be opposed to funding the trails. But I just have concerns about that. But basically, I believe this bill just gives more power to the people through their elected representatives to handle this issue. And it's basically just a way to promote state sovereignty and to make sure that the federal government doesn't become too expansive and too intrusive. I'll stand for questions.
Committee questions? Representative Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Brett, thanks for being here this morning. The Katy Trail on the Missouri side, you're familiar with that trail. Was that any eminent domain or anything that we were talking about this morning used to obtain land for the Katy Trail across the state of Missouri?
As far as I know, the only trail that's used eminent domain is the Appalachian Trail. However, like I said, I believe there is the potential of eminent domain being used in the future because a lot of the groups and activists for these trails are advocating for that. And so that was my point. But as far as I know, the Appalachian Trail is the only trail that's used eminent domain. I mean, that is something that the research could look into, or the revisers could look into, but that's the only one I specifically know of.
Representative Burkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the bill in question is talking about historic trail versus recreational. So I assume people aren't going to be walking up and down the trail. It's more maybe just preserving or indicating that, significant activity happened here. So in my mind, I think eminent domain would be a lot less likely to be used because people I don't believe they're actually going to be walking along it in my mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, like I said, I just think the potential is there because some of the people that are big advocates for the trail have advocated that. And, this is a little bit questionable as to whether this is accurate or not, but I have heard that sometimes eminent domain can be used locally for this purpose, and then the local governments can kind of work hand in hand with the National Park Service. And that's just something that I've heard. I don't know 100% whether that's true or not, but that's something that I've been told sometimes happens.
And then I guess just from a basic private property right, if it's your property and you want it to become part of the trail, does it make sense that you have to have the state legislature approve that process? I mean, it seems maybe a little bit counterintuitive from traditional.
Well, I don't think the state legislature has to approve the process of somebody, selling their own land or providing access to their land to the National Park Service. But I mean, this legislation does basically say that the legislature would have to approve the national heritage areas and the national trails. But if they didn't approve it, it would basically just mean that all state funding would be cut off for it. I mean, it wouldn't mean that these trails wouldn't exist because we don't have the power to, prevent the federal government from doing that. The way I interpret the bill is it would simply cut off or ensure that there would be no state funding that would be allocated to the national trails or national heritage areas.
Okay, thank you.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Representative Fairchild. Next, we have Representative Carrie Barth. Representative Barth, welcome to committee.
Thank you so much for having me here today. And Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair, Ranking Members, and honorable members of the committee, I stand before you today as a proponent for HB 2476. And I come to you not only as a legislator, but actually as a property owner that sits in the footprint of the National Heritage Freedom Frontier. Actually, a lot of you in this room here today are in the footprint. I encourage you to look at my testimony that I submitted online at the second page, which includes a map of the area of where this is. I have some other testimony prepared, but I do want to expand on what Representative Fairchild mentioned. I don't think this is just about trails. This is a land grab issue. In Douglas County, where I live, which we are right in the center of this, Lawrence, Kansas, as well as Nebraska, is the headquarters for the Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area. We have currently going on something called open spaces. If you guys don't know about open spaces, look up all the words. There's so many words they can use: conservation projects, trails, you name it. You could be a butterfly conservatory. And this is a way for them to take your land under the guise of something else. So I became aware of this Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area about 3 or 4 years ago. And basically at that time, I wanted to let them know that this is but first of all, this is a self-appointed bureaucrat group of people that are not elected by the people. And I sent them a letter declaring my land to not be part of this Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area, flexing my freedoms as I'm a property owner in the footprint. What I have in front of you here today is a letter that they sent back to me, basically stating that I don't understand and I can't do that. So if you don't believe this is a land grab and we're looking at eminent domain issues on steroids at some point in time when they decide that they want to go forward with a 30 by 30 land grab, and I mean, basically you're looking at about a third of the land in our area, including Missouri and Nebraska as well. So this is exactly why Kansas needs to vote for this as a law to provide us protections that just don't exist today. We cannot allow for just a few appointed bureaucrats to declare that taking the Kansas land. There's Democrats and Republicans, so this is a bipartisan issue where we have homeowners that could be affected with unnecessary eminent domain issues. You know, I put myself in our forefathers that came forth on this country, and we did take away land from people at one point in time. We took it away from our Native Americans that lived here prior to us. And I look at this as being this, well, probably a very similar situation, that we're looking at our land having no choice if they're going to take it or not. And it's our federal government, our own government, where we pay our own tax dollars to, is looking at taking our own land at some point in time for something they'll call, I'm sure you're going to hear from the opponents to this bill, oh, that's not right. It's for something else. It's for good. But when it's your land and you own it, I'm going to tell you right here as just a property owner that I do not agree with that. So appreciate your support on this. And thank you very much. And if you have questions, let me know.
Okay.
I'm going to head to committee after this.
Representative Clayton.
All right. Well, Representative, I will keep this short and sweet. I hope that you don't think it's weird, but I totally looked up your address to see how close you lived to the Blackjack battlefield. In my previous life, I used to be a historian for the Johnson County Museum of History. So I'm very familiar with Freedom's Frontier. Yikes. Okay. Anyway, God, I hate microphones. But anyway, so I know that it was designated by Congress in 2006. And for those of you that were curious, it was supposed to be called Bleeding Kansas, but the Missouri cried about it. I think they should get over it. They lost. We won. It should be called, Kansas Focus. But in any case, have you all, I know that you've reached out to their actual office. Have you reached out to any of the Kansas congressional delegation to see where they are on this? Because perhaps aligning with the federal government, and I think that you would have some sympathetic voices there too, and they might have more power. Have you all and your group reached out to Congress, and what has that looked like? Because I can understand the frustration. I just want to know the path.
It's frustrating reaching out to even getting a hold of our federal congressmen and women. So they just are not the most responsive sometimes, busy with everything else. And so I've reached out about a lot of things. Would love to have a sit down meeting with them about what's going on here locally. But yeah, in the past I have reached out.
All right. Well, no, I appreciate that. Probably when I go back, I might reach out to at least the 3rd District Congresswoman, because a lot of her district is within Freedom's Frontier. And I'll at least reach out to her staff and let you all know what I find out, just because if nothing else, I can understand the frustrations. And sometimes when it comes to property rights, it's sort of like a multi-front war. So I do appreciate you all taking the time to come here, because I understand the frustrations. And thanks a lot. Have fun in committee.
Thank you very much. Representative Bueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know you got to go to committee meetings. So help me understand, if you would, Representative, how is this tied to the 30 by 30 initiative?
I'm actually going to let one of the other proponents address that issue that's coming up here in just a minute, who has extensively studied the 30 by 30. But this is tied to the fact that they want 30% of our land and water by 2030. And this is part of that plan. It's spelled out with the Biden administration even, but I think it's even started before then. So I'll let Angel Cushing, who's here, I know is testifying today as well.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Representative Barth, head for committee. Okay, next we have Angel Cushing. Angel, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. God bless you for even looking at this. This has been a long, passionate battle that started in 2021 when we found out about the Kansas-Nebraska Heritage Area Partnership, which was a national heritage area trying to go in. The purpose of this legislation is transparency. You're absolutely right, Representative Sanders. Congress gets to decide whether or not these come in. Only Congress can add counties and areas. Only Congress can take them away. The only thing that you can do is ask for a little bit more transparency. One of the things that when we started talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Heritage Area Partnership, we accidentally notified people in Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area because it's been there since 2006. We figured that was a losing battle that could not be undone. The two main questions that I got from people is, why didn't anyone tell me? How could they put this boundary in without me even knowing? And does this have anything to do with the stricter regulations that are coming down to my area? The answer to that question is we don't know, because you cannot drop a Freedom of Information request on a nonprofit such as Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. Yes, we have talked to Congress. Tracy Mann was our strongest champion. When I told him about the Kansas-Nebraska Heritage Area Partnership, the first words out of his mouth were, Angel, you're telling me they're lying to me. Well, that naturally led to who is they and how long have they been lying. We found out from our Freedom of Information request, that answer was 5 years. 5 years, Kansas-Nebraska Heritage Area Partnership was lobbying Congress to become a national heritage area, telling them that the people love this, they want it, they know about it, and they think it's awesome. That was not true. We never met one person in that 49 county area that even knew that there was a national heritage area targeted for their area. The purpose of this bill is notification, if not the landowner themselves, because we understand that's a very expensive process, then at least the state legislature through the legislative body. And hopefully those boundaries and borders will be a little bit more realistic. I understand Lawrence's desire to talk about and historically elevate the Lawrence area in Bleeding, Kansas. I totally get that. Do they have the right to incorporate 26 other Kansas counties without the county commissioners even knowing about it? That is the purpose of this legislation. This legislation takes after Montana's legislation and North Dakota's legislation. There are two states that have similar legislation to this. We simply combine the two. Legislators in the state of Montana helped us draft this better based on their mistakes, what they would have liked to have seen. It is being watched by the state of Missouri, state of Nebraska, and the state of Oklahoma, and interest is growing in the state of Arkansas. So as I said, only Congress can create a federal jurisdiction. Only Congress can remove property from it. There is no desire to do so. So all we ask is, if they do not pass the muster or the majority of votes in the state legislature, that no state funding can go to this. It does not change deeds. It does not remove any property. Nobody loses property. Nobody gets fired from this. If they fail to get the state legislative bodies vote, then that would force them to have to go to the communities that they tell Congress who wanted these designations, it will force them to go to those communities to raise their funds. And we think that that is probably the best way to go about this. I think that's pretty much everything. I do have within my written testimony several resolutions passed by counties in Kansas and Nebraska. Of those 49 counties, 45 have passed resolutions not wanting to be in there. We have 8 in Freedom's Frontier, several on the trails. The trails are different from national heritage areas. The minute that designation goes in, they become a National Park Service unit right out of the gate. Once again, landowners are not told. The special interest groups behind them, usually in Kansas, for example, and I'm going to use Santa Fe Trail because it goes right by me. Those folks are great, wonderful. They do a wonderful job of working with landowners. Right across the border in Colorado, it's a whole nother ballgame. They even get onto Pinyon Canyon, which is a military base, about their lights interfering with the view shed. Once these NHAs and trails go in, they instantly become leverage in Congress for expansion. On trails, it's view shed protection. View shed is for as far as the eye can see. On NHAs, it's also view shed protection within that. Both of them come with comprehensive plans. In the case of national heritage areas, they come with federal land management plans that are guided by the National Park Service and must be adopted 3 years after they become a national heritage area. That's a land management plan on private property that no private property owner was even allowed to elect or see prior to that NHA. So I think I'll finish here and I will stand for any questions.
Very good. Thank you. Committee questions. Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. But I'm a little confused because we just heard 2 testimonies about eminent domain, and in yours testimony, it doesn't sound like this bill prevents that. And how could you clarify that for me? Because it seems like your request is this provides transparency, and then not supporting if Congress does designate an area.
Well, it's an awfully lot more difficult to use eminent domain if everybody is aware of what's going on. So a lot of these issues, such as eminent domain, is used without the knowledge of the general people as a whole. So being more transparent does in fact discourage that. So the National Park Service really likes to use local people. For example, national heritage areas, I refer to those board members as the first victims. They have to get sold this idea, and then that's the local face that then gets the rest of the whether it's through economic development or whatever, gets the counties to increase regulations or comply with EPA or whatever that case may be. It's just a lot harder for the National Park Service to use eminent domain. Nature Conservancy and local officials is the preferred method of using eminent domain. So it's actually, I get asked that question a lot, how much eminent domain has been used. That's really hard to discover. You have to go to everywhere along these trails and in these NHAs through the local offices and find out who changed the deeds and how they were done. I can tell you at public meetings, I hear horror stories. It's usually old timers that come up to me afterwards to tell me that they got a knock on their door and it's right after they have lost their spouse. And it may be something as simple like, we can ensure that your family, your kids will have this farm if you do a conservation easement, or we are going to eminent domain your property, but you'll make more money if you sell it to this organization. So if you look at congressional record, it's ks.gov, and you simply put in testimonies for national heritage areas, you'll get all kinds of stories about people that went before Congress and testified how that process works. Western states is also a very good example of how that's done. So to tie that into 30 by 30, 30 by 30 is the first time an administration has confessed to doing what they've been doing out in Western states for the last 70 years. Most of the laws that are needed to implement 30 by 30 are there and have been there since the 1980s. What they're doing is closing access to our national parks, whether that's campgrounds, whether that's your favorite hiking trail, while, and the term that was told to me was called democratizing private property, while encouraging public access to private property on other fronts. So as they're closing up lands that the federal government already owns, they are expanding influence and jurisdiction through designations, through proclamations, and encouraging public trespass onto private property. Does that answer your question, sir? Okay.
Committee, further questions? Representative Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Cushing, for your testimony. I was looking at the previous conferee's handout, and it gives the map of the NHA's boundaries. And my county's in that, and the esteemed honorable representative who sits to the left of me, his county's in that. Does that mean federal supremacy? Is that telling us or raising a white flag or a red flag saying that the federal government has confiscated these lands, but yet we don't know it yet?
So legally, this is a federal, because it's voted on by Congress and the boundary is drawn. Legally, this is federal jurisdiction, no different than Fort Riley or McConnell Air Force Base. Have they implemented it, and have they dropped the Antiquities Act and declared a monument on any of the 62 that we know of? No. What they're using is local coercion at the local level. There are 3 national heritage areas that are now completely abolished of people and are now National Park Service units. So it just depends on what the federal courts are, who the special interest groups are that are implementing the land management plans, and what the community around there will tolerate. But to answer your question, yes, technically, at any time, they can drop the Antiquities Act of 1906 on any of these national heritage areas or designations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, further questions?
If I may follow up.
Oh, go
Thank
ahead.
you, sir. Would this be, in your guesstimation, I don't know if you're a constitutional lawyer, but would this be a violation of the 10th Amendment? I mean, when
there isn't too many places in the Constitution that this doesn't violate.
Well, I guess my issue is that there's no say from the states. You know, we have the federal government coming down, confiscating states or gobbling up wide swaths of land like a Pac-Man game, and then there's no hearing from the states, the local people. And with this, I think you said 62 counties?
62 national heritage areas in the country.
I don't know. This is a pretty big swath of land here so I think the states honestly should have more voice just for local government and the individuals to be educated on what's going on. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Burkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have there been any lawsuits regarding national heritage areas?
There have been a few. There are some investigative, what they call those, internal investigations as well, but they all evolve around particular land acquisitions. So not generally, because most people, for example, the entire state of Tennessee is in a national heritage area. Nobody in Tennessee even knows it. So the knowledge is not there for really to garner a lawsuit at this time that I know of.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, sir, for one more. I don't know if you're aware, but years ago, we did a thing called Rails to Trails or something like that. And I have an old abandoned right-of-way behind, well, in my property. Would would that allude to some of this? Would that, if the federal government said, hey, dude, we want to make a trail in the back of your property, could they confiscate that land?
So if you get on the National Park Service website and you put in National Heritage Area, you'll actually find that one of their accomplishments that they're noting is how many trails they have built inside National Heritage Areas. So I do know that the trail program is tied into the overall program. Trails have been funded by Congress since at least 2012. KDOT here in Kansas has a chunk of money earmarked specifically for trails, but they are going in all over the country, not just in National Heritage Areas, but yes, this is all kind of comes part of that program.
Seeing no more questions, thank you very much. Okay, next we have Beth Salmons. Beth, welcome to committee.
Thank you for doing this and listening. I'm nervous, but you have my lengthy testimony, and there's no way, I found out yesterday, I can completely read through that to you. What I want to drill down on is, as Angel mentioned, there's a management plan, and y'all have this as an attachment to my testimony. On the forward page, it reads this: while park staff conduct management planning and environmental compliance as an integrated process, heritage area staff can conduct management planning and NEPA compliance as a separate parallel process. NEPA is the National Environmental Protection Act. Over on Chapter 1, 1.2, environmental compliance. This is specially formulated through the environmental impact study they do for every federal project. So that, there's one for trails or for your national parks, everything that has a federal designation. This is for the heritage areas. Environmental compliance. Since NHA management plans are approved by the Secretary of the Interior, the approval is considered a federal action, and therefore federal environmental laws, including NEPA and other laws such as Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, must be followed. And they go on to list their favorite laws that they like to use. The first one is the National Environmental Policy Act. Then they list other applicable laws, including the two I mentioned, a couple of executive orders, and then they say Floodplain Management and Wetlands Protections and Coastal Management Act. So there comes your WOTUS rules. And when that was posted, I believe it was last May for comment, they were bringing back all of the old rules that the previous administration had gotten rid of. They were going to bring those back, and they stated that they were going to enhance them. Now, when I heard that enhancement, it made me think, how can they enhance this any more than calling a puddle on your driveway a wetland? There were people in Washington, I know, that were harassed off their land because they had a water collection pond on their property. So they can come down, this authorizes them to come down and use these federal regulations. And as Angel said, the National Historic Preservation Act, that's how they took the West. Not much left of Utah that's not in federal control. And this is, we were talking about the endangered species. This is a map of Freedom's Frontier, and I believe you have this as an attachment. It lists all of the endangered species for each one of these counties, both state and federal. So they're ready to go. They know where they all are. So I guess that's my main points. And also, Angel found an article in the Observer where they were wanting to use, they said now is the time, they want to use the NHAs to help complete the 30 by 30. And I also included that article in your testimony, or in my testimony. So if you'd look through that, I'd appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you for that. Committee questions. Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I appreciate your testimony, Beth. And I'm interested in your shirt, Freedom to Farm and Ranch.
Yes.
Do you feel like that freedom is really being threatened by this?
I do. Every fiber of my being.
Thank you.
What you're seeing over in Europe, you're seeing the farmers rise. Same thing's coming here. They've already started. They are in that process. They want to push everybody into the cities. They don't want you out there farming. And I can tell you, Angel has been to a World Economic Forum meeting. She got in there kind of back door. She was invited. And they were talking about importing beef from Africa, raising our crops and beef and importing them from Africa and turning everything from the Eastern Rocky Mountain front over to the Appalachians into a conservation. So that's their long-term goal. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to stop at 30%. By 2050, they want half of it in the whole world in conservation. So we are out here sounding alarms. We need the state to get in there and, have a say in this. There's no way that we can probably stop this designation from coming in, but we can have some say. My voice is giving out. I was sick last week. If the state has some say in it, you can help dry up those funds if they're not behaving or if they start harassing our farmers. They'll have to find their funding from some NGOs or something.
Very good. Thank you, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
Committee,
Sorry.
very briefly.
Of course. No, thank you for being here. So as you all were talking, I was looking up a map of all of the historic heritage areas because I'm mostly familiar with Kansas. If you look, almost like the whole state of Tennessee is under one. Have any of you talked to anyone from Tennessee? It might be a good idea to...
I tried to contact Marsha Blackburn's office, but I didn't hear back. We had a hard time just getting our legislators on board. We got Tracy Mann on board because we caught him face-to-face at a Republican GOP meeting. And like Angel said, he looked her in the eyes and said, "You mean they've been lying? You're telling me they've been lying to me?" And so...
But yeah, I would say reach out to some citizens in Tennessee because if they're still, definitely that appears to be the most encompassing heritage area that I see on the map. So find some allies there. And that's what I would suggest would be another point, and then, go from there. But I really appreciate you being here today.
And we worked a booth at the Marshall County State Fair, and we had some folks from Tennessee come through. And they were looking at the big map we had up behind our booth and said, "Our whole state's in a National Heritage Area." And I said, "Yes, it is." And, "Well, what's that mean?" And so, I went in and I explained exactly what that meant. So if we can prevent this, Montana and North Dakota have taken action on this. Arkansas is taking some action. Angel's been all over the country in Zooms, I think. But they are starting, some of the states are starting to take some action and get the state involved in these things.
Very good. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Committee, I'll bring your attention to the written proponents here. And next we have neutrals. Walter Wolf. Is he on WebEx?
I had to unmute myself.
Okay.
I'm sure.
Very good. Thank you for being at committee.
You can all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you, for, Chairman Carpenter, Vice Chairman Kessler, and Representative Hoy, and members of the committee for the opportunity to submit this neutral testimony regarding HB 247. As the former treasurer for the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area Board of Trustees, I'm here to clarify that we have been in existence for 18 years and are not in a danger to private property rights. As a private property landowner and on behalf of the Monarch Cement Company, which owns over 5,000 acres of land within Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area border, I can emphatically say that if Freedom's Frontier was a threat to my or my company's property rights or water rights, I would not support it. As you may have heard, President Reagan, a conservative, created national heritage areas as an alternative to national parks to stimulate the economic development of heritage and agritourism without the government having to own the property. Furthermore, President Donald Trump followed suit with his approval of the last 6 heritage areas in the United States. When you look at the law that governs Freedom's Frontier, you'll find that the organization was created with private property owners in the driver's seat. No property owner becomes a part of the heritage area unless they have agreed to do so in writing. There has been misinformation that says anyone living or owning property in the heritage area was opted in without their permission. Instead, it is exactly the opposite. No one can become a partner in our heritage area without agreeing in writing that they want to be included. In addition, their property would have to be historically significant for Freedom's Frontier to even consider accepting their application. Today, we have close to 300 partners up and down the Kansas and Missouri state line, which are mostly small museums and county historical societies. The synergies of these small entities working together in concert under the Freedom's Frontier umbrella helps tell their tale and link the threads of history between our partner communities. By collaborating and combining their resources, our member partners can more effectively and efficiently communicate the rich history relating to the Civil War and pioneering history in these towns. In my opinion, the result of stimulating interest in our rich heritage and culture will be an increase in tourism and the dollars visitors bring with them. For smaller rural communities like Humboldt, those tourists make a real difference as a revenue stream for our communities. In fact, for every dollar that Freedom's Frontier receives from the federal government to recognize our history, we return $5.50 to the communities where our partners are located. For those of you who might not know Humboldt's history, it was burned to the ground by a band of guerrillas during the Bleeding Kansas border wars. We have been in existence for 18 years at Freedom's Frontier, and we have never had one complaint about private property infringement. That's because by law, we are not allowed to interfere with land or water rights. We also cannot interfere with hunting or fishing rights, and that protection has always existed. Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area is an excellent example of how one works. It promotes the settlement of the frontier and its rich agricultural heritage, the border war and the Civil War history of the Western frontier, and the enduring struggle for freedom in this region. Historic sites and museums volunteered to be part of the effort by becoming partners with the organization. Freedom's Frontier provides grants, support to local museum directors, and publicity to the partners at no cost to the partner or the county or the city in which they are located. Freedom's Frontier simply showcases the partner sites to encourage tourism to their communities. To summarize, I want to be clear about why Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area cannot be a danger to private property owners. By law, no land is automatically a part of Freedom's Frontier without their written permission. By law, no private property owner is required to participate in or be associated with Freedom's Frontier. By law, a historic site or museum must request to be included as a partner with Freedom's Frontier. By law, Freedom's Frontier is prohibited from owning property. By law, Freedom's Frontier has no authority to require access to any property. By law, Freedom's Frontier has no authority for zoning or land use regulation. This one is really important, as there has been some misinformation that we influence zoning committees. By law, Freedom's Frontier has no authority over land, water, or hunting or fishing rights. By law, Freedom's Frontier cannot impose any burden on any property owner. And by law, Freedom's Frontier cannot interfere with any state, county, or city's laws. I appreciate being able to clarify this for the committee. And after hearing some of the testimony that I've heard this morning, I feel with my tongue firmly implanted in my cheek that I think I need to clarify that I want to opt out of being the representative of the House for the House of District 9, which currently is held by Fred Gardner. I want to opt out of being a member of your committee. Physically, if this would work better if I was physically in your presence, because I'm in the geographic area, the confines of your meeting room. I feel that I would necessarily have to opt out of being a member of your committee. To which you would say, well, dear Walter, you aren't an elected official. You're not a member of this committee. You would have to be elected and be appointed to this committee. To which I would say, well, but that doesn't matter. I need to opt out anyway. So how can you opt out of being a member if you never were a member? True, we are all within the geographic area that has been designated Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, but that doesn't make us members. And I respectfully submit my testimony, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Very good, Walter. Thank you for that. Committee questions. Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Walter, why do you characterize your testimony as neutral? It sounds pretty, you sound like an opponent to me.
Well, I'm not currently on the Board of Trustees. We have 3 sites in Humboldt, the Orchid Museum, the Humboldt Historical Society. I'm trying to think of the other one right now, but anyway, I'd hate to see those being their future jeopardized by not being able to allow ourselves to have the support of Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area.
So do you see any way that you could become a supporter of this bill?
It would be tough to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Walter, for being here. Okay, next we'll go. Oh, Representative Howes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for catching my wave at you. Thank you for your testimony today, Mr. Wolf. I'm familiar with Monarch City, man. I'm a construction man myself. And I'm familiar with the quarry that we turned into trails last year or 2 ago. I got a couple of questions, if Ben, you're neutral on this. How many employees do you have that actually live within any of these areas that are in question of being a trail? I mean, would we uprooting any of your employees this way?
It would be about 172.
172?
And I'm not familiar with any proposed trails. We have the rail trail that goes from Humboldt up to Iola, but that's already in existence. There's a potential. There's an old rail bed that runs from Humboldt down to Parsons, but that's really not part of. It's within Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area geographic area, but it's, to my knowledge, there's no organization that has requested to be a member of Freedom's Frontier that is a trail. The trail is not part of Freedom's Frontier.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and move along. Thank you, Walter, for being here. We've got 4 other folks to testify, and so we're going to try to move this along. Next, I have Bob Totten as a neutral. Bob, welcome to committee. I haven't seen you for a while.
No, it's been 7 years, and when you finally retire from being a lobbyist, you become an executive director of the Shawnee County Historical Society, and because of that association, I became a trustee with Freedom's Frontier, and I've been designated to talk. So I said I would, because Kent Glasscock, a former Speaker of the House, is a member of our organization also, and he had other duties, so I got to be put into this today. I know you folks are wondering what we're talking about today, and I've heard different things. We have nothing to do with trails. I have provided you a map, just like others, but it has nothing to do with property. It's basically a coordination of activities of museums like ours or other historical sites. I think you need to be aware that we're not doing that. And matter of fact, as you've heard, our group was established 20 years ago. There are 62 national heritage areas around the United States that are funded through the auspices of the United States government. The U.S. Senate approved this unanimously. There was a vote more recently that supported that. We have nothing to do with the 30 by 30 aspect. This bill that's before you doesn't talk about the 30 by 30. We're neutral. Back to your question, sir. We're neutral because it really doesn't have anything to do with our concerns. So you can pass it. We'd like to change some of the verbiage, the whereas that you were asking about, the preamble. We feel like that needs to be tweaked. When we had our hearing yesterday in front of the Senate, the reviser indicated we would have input for that. The chair suggested that we have that opportunity because there are certain things that are in the whereas that are not really exactly correct. But we're not taking private property rights. All 105 counties were contacted in 2006 when they were talking about the National Heritage Area. So the county commissions have the ability to opt in or opt out. And just like Walter Wolf just said, you know, this is just a collection of historical sites. We use the opportunity that the federal government has decided to help us with tourism. The dollar in, $5.50 back is important. Governor Bennett back in the mid-70s told me that tourism was the 3rd largest industry of the state of Kansas, and I really thought he wasn't truthful or he didn't know, but it is. And we merit, just like Mr. Wolf talked about in Humboldt, people coming into your community. I am a glorified tour guide for the Shawnee County Historical Society. We have folks from China, Denmark, Florida, Arizona, and California that come in to see about the Ritchie House. Some of your spouses have come by the historic Ritchie House, which is an Underground Railroad site, and it's the oldest building in Topeka, to find out about Bleeding Kansas and to find out what our heritage has been. But our organization, the National or the Freedom's Frontier Group, has no plans to take property. It is to coordinate tourism aspects and the ability to preserve and promote history here in the state of Kansas. And you folks should embrace it. We do not oppose the bill. We're not in favor of the bill, but we're not saying there's any problems with it presently in its present form. I'll stand for questions if you have those.
Very good. Committee questions. Representative Howe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a question for you. I'm so sorry. It's okay.
My apologies.
No. So based off of your testimony in the previous conferee, if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is that the Board of County Commissioners for these areas were notified back in 2006. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay. And you are also saying that the National Heritage Areas do not actually ever, so when you say they don't actually control or try to get control of private lands or they don't try to use private lands?
Our situation is to talk about historical sites and museums, and our organization supports that effort. We're not after land. We have nothing to do with trails. You know, there's been a lot of talk this morning about the Appalachian Trail. It's the only trail that has that eminent domain. We do not do any eminent domain at this time, and we don't plan to. That's not in the legislation that the Congress has approved, that President Reagan promoted back in 1984 and approved by Mr. Bush and Mr. Trump.
If I may. So could you explain to me how did the eminent domain with the Appalachian Trail occur? Was that a separate organization? Was that a separate organization and not this one? Or, I mean, how does that?
The Appalachian Trail, if I recall, was probably designated back in the mid-30s, prior to in the 1930s, and it has nothing to do with the National Heritage Group at all, except that we recognize that it's a 3,500, that's probably too many, but 2,000-mile trail. It's a separate issue totally, but we do not, our organization, our present organization, which has 41 counties from Missouri and Kansas, has nothing to do with trails. We're not taking any land. We're not worried about water rights. The trails is not our deal.
Thank you very much.
Very good, Bob. Thank you very much for being, Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I read on page 2 of the bill in section C, line 10, this is, well, let's just jump down and go to line 12. This is just asking that the people's representatives would be able to be notified and be able to have their voice involved in this with the federal designations. I think it just allows another layer of transparency, in my opinion. And something that you had said, and the previous conferee had said also, in order to be enlisted, you have to sign up, or in order to be in this heritage, you have to sign up. Now, when you guys say sign up, you're not meeting just individuals, you're just meeting the 3 or 5.
We go to a subset of your jurisdiction, which is a county commission, and we ask the county, or people petition their county commissioners to be included in the National Heritage Freedoms Foundation or Frontier Organization. So there is a process that goes through a political opportunity. We're not asking people, we're asking the representatives of the area to so designate. And this is an opt-in, like we've talked about, but it's also an opt-out. Osage County, I believe, opt-out. Excuse me, sir, I'm sorry.
How do you opt out? I mean,
vote as county commission. Mostly you get 2 county commissioners to vote and say we want to opt out of 3, the majority rules.
Not trying to be smarty, but is there like official documents or?
I have appeared before several county commissions, as Mr. Wolf has done, to talk about our organization and what it needs to be done. It's up to the county commissioners to determine whether they want to do this or not.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative McNorton.
Just real quick, you mentioned Reagan, Bush, and maybe some others. How many presidents since Reagan have supported this? Or
since 1984, I'm not familiar with anybody who has not supported it. In general, this started out as a Republican plan in the 80s and by Mr. Reagan, and it's further got endorsed by successive presidents. Yes, sir, to my knowledge. And part of the stuff that I have provided you shows that in a sheet here that tells you the progression of the legislation. I don't know if you have this or not, but I'll be glad to present it, which talks about Mr. Reagan in 1984, Mr. Bush in 2006, Mr. Trump in 2019, and then in 22, Congress authorized the heritage areas with private property protections. and that's part of the federal law.
Very good, Bob. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for your time.
Next, we have Brad Lovelace, Secretary of Wildlife and Parks. Brad, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman Carpenter and members of the committee. I am Brad Lovelace, Secretary of Wildlife and Parks, and unfortunately today I've got two of our experts on parks, Linda Lannerman, who's the director of our Parks Division, and also Jeff Bender, who's a regional supervisor. Both of them know a lot more about parks than I do, and if you have hard questions, I'd like them to be able to answer them. House Bill 2476 focuses on upholding Kansas sovereignty by prohibiting state funds from being used to match federal monies on these national heritage areas or on natural trails without legislative approval. The Wildlife and Parks is neutral on this bill. However, it requests some clarifying amendments to the bill that would provide clear direction and, we believe, improve the legislation. The original purpose of the national heritage areas, as has been mentioned in the trails, was to build public attention and create economic development. Wildlife and Parks does not participate in the designation or administration of heritage sites. In fact, there's very little interaction between our agency and the National Park Service. That being said, it is our understanding that the Park Service doesn't actually designate heritage sites. They only administer the heritage sites after they've been designated, and that's been discussed by previous testimonials. Within our the heritage sites that occur now, House Bill 2476 isn't clear as to what happens on structures that we have currently contained within the sites. Wildlife and Parks currently has facilities and infrastructure in place in two areas that have received National Heritage Site designation, both the Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area as well as the Santa Fe Trail National Historic Trail. The Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area consists of 29 eastern Kansas counties, and coincidentally, and it is by coincidence, within that area, our agency has 14 state parks and many smaller properties, such as wildlife areas and state fishing lakes that it manages. The Santa Fe Trail National Heritage Area closely aligns with 30 miles of our Flint Hills Trail State Park and is directly on top of about 6 miles of that trail. These properties don't, as I said, have a relationship to those national heritage areas, but when designations occur, they encompassed our existing areas. Although Wildlife and Parks uses its funds to support the existing facilities and infrastructure that we have within those areas, it does not apply these funds for the purpose of promoting or benefiting these areas as national heritage sites. As such, we would request clarifying amendments to subsections B and C, prohibiting only the use of state funds when they're being expended for the promotion of a heritage site, or an alternative amendment could be to just exclude Wildlife and Parks properties that are owned or contracted within those national heritage areas. For example, our walk-in hunting access areas, which have over 1 million acres across the state where landowners enroll, we compensate them, and they allow the public to come in and hunt or fish on their areas. It's very popular with Kansans as well as our visitors, but we believe that this language could be used to not allow us to continue those contracts on those walk-in hunting and fishing areas. While we're very confident that the intent of this bill was not to impact our properties, because it could be construed as that, we would appreciate changes to the language that would exclude our properties. With that, I stand for questions, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you for that. Committee, some brief questions. Representative Epley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We were visiting over here and we were listening, and you were covering that pretty fast. I didn't quite get how that would affect walk-in hunting areas, this legislation. How do you connect those dots? I didn't quite do that.
So it says we can't use state funds in these areas, and we have walk-in sites within those 29 counties. And we're using state funds to compensate those landowners to enroll in those. So that's the concern we have.
In the legislation, I think it's involved ownership or taking over the land. I don't see how that would impede that program. I'm just not quite there yet.
I think where it says in the back that no state funds will be expended, he's talking about the state funds that he would use to lease that property for walk-in hunting. That's his concern.
Okay, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, further questions? Thank you very much, Brad, for being here.
Thank you.
I'm trying to move things along a little bit here. Committee, written neutral from Steve Hitchcock. Next, we have opponents. Dennis, I'm not even going to try to mention. Oh, it's written. Okay, I guess we are done then. Okay. Well, very good. Well, committee, any questions real quick? Seeing none, we're adjourned.